don't know me, my name is Carl Pearson. I'm the Associate Director in the Center for the Study of the Middle East. Welcome to all of you and to our speaker, Dr. Gana. Before I begin, I just want to say a couple words. First of all, I'd like to express our thanks to the Middle East Languages and Cultures Department. And the chair has graced us with his presence today. Thank you for co-sponsoring the event. We are, the Center for the Study of the Middle East is a Title VI National Resource Center funded by the Department of Education. So I'd like to express my appreciation for the funding from the U.S. government for our activities, including today's event. And there's a QR code, I believe they call it, scattered around. That will take you to a survey. If you'd be so kind as to click on that and give us some results. The Department of Education wants to hear whether or not what we're doing is amenable to the audiences that we present to. So, then, without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Nouri Gana, professor in comparative literature and Near Eastern languages and cultures. Near Eastern languages and cultures. We used to have a Near Eastern languages and cultures department here, but no longer. And comparative literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. And he is currently on a grand book tour of the Midwest. Unfortunately, he didn't bring Los Angeles weather with him.
It was raining.
Nonetheless, I hope the spring is attractive to you. And so his talk today focuses on his new book entitled Melancholy Acts, Defeat and Cultural Critique in the Arab World. And with that, I turn it over to you, Dr.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you so much for being here. I know it's always tough to get audiences, to get people to go to talks. Yeah, especially for a book talk. I think the book talk genre is disappearing. So people are doing something else. So anyway, so what I'm going to try to make it light and hopefully, perhaps, entertaining. So I will discuss a thread in the book which deals with the concept of melancholy acts through some of the idioms in Mahmoud Darwish's poetry, and through a short story by Gana, just to give a sense of what I mean by the concept of melancholy acts. So I'll just dive in since I have this written out, and hopefully we'll leave a lot of time for discussion since we have a small group, we can have discussions, including questions from you. Okay, I'll start with this one. Okay, in a poem called Ahmed al-Za'atar, Mahmoud Darwish describes his epic hero as follows: صاعدا نحو التئام الحلم. Okay, which literally means that Ahmed, which is also another one of the prophet's names, is ascending high to bandage the dream. So this is, as you may have noticed, an awkward construction in English, since the right idiomatic expression would be to bandage or suture a wound, and not a dream. Similarly, in Arabic we say التأم الجرح, and not التأم الحلم. The new construction, التأم الحلم, can be seen therefore as a distortion of, or a deviation from the original idiom التأم الجرح, even while it clearly remains dependent on it for its potential recognizability. Okay, I will come back to these. In the titular section of يوميات الحزن العادي, Diaries of Ordinary Sadness, which is an unclassifiable collection of texts that chronicles everyday Palestinianness and their occupation, Darwish starts fragment number 17 with the following observation: أحيانا يلقون عليك القبض وأنت ترتكب الحلم. Literally, this means in English, they sometimes arrest you Yes, they sometimes arrest you while you're committing the dream. In Arabic, as in English, the expression ارتكب الحلم, or to commit the dream, is not fluent. Okay? It is an idiomatic, in fact. So the right idiomatic expression would be ارتكب جريمة or ارتكب خطأ, to commit a crime or to commit an error. Okay? So the question is, what is exactly going on here? Does not Darwish know his Arabic idioms very well? That would not be the case. Does he not know that idiomatic expressions are fixed and language-bound entities which constitute the distinctive characteristics, if not the ornaments, of a given language? Its untouchable repository and its most inviolable and untranslatable features? How come, for instance, that Darwish keeps untiringly fashioning and refashioning the Arabic idiom, في مهب الريح, which roughly evokes the irrecoverable loss of something, into such variable idiomatic neologisms as في مهب العراق, في مهب الغياب, في مهب الورق? While anything that is في مهب الريح could be rendered into English as gone with the wind, the new variations on the idiom are practically untranslatable, even though we might always content ourselves with such literal renditions as in the passage wind of Iraq, for في مهب العراق, and in the passage wind of absence for في مهب الغياب, and so on and so forth. So it should have become clear that Darwish's style of idiomatic practice seeks to interfere with the received lucidity and intelligibility of the Arabic idiom, to disturb its primitive semantic structure and its seemingly unruffled indifference to the enormity of the Palestinian plight. The particular poetic venture of Mahmoud Darwish, as I see it, consists not so much in his rebelliousness against the transhistorical stability of the Arabic idiom, as in his problematic attempt to confront it with the mutability and precarity of Arab and Palestinian contemporary history. His wide-ranging surgical operations on the Arabic idiom seek therefore to transplant it in the Arab present, that is, to locate it and simultaneously open it up to its fierce historical and political contemporaneity. Mahmoud Darwish, and I'm going to use the language of the book, melancholizes the idiom. And by that I mean he makes the idiom carry the burden of the colonial present. But he does not abandon it without melancholicizing it. That is, without instilling in it the vision of a future free from the injustices of the past and the present. It is no exaggeration to suggest that the suddenness with which the novelty of an idiomatic expression is recognized verges truly on the epiphanic. In ارتكب الحلم, to commit the dream, for instance, which is, as I mentioned, an idiomatic plan on ارتكب الجريمة, to commit the crime, the sudden recognition that this idiomatic neologism departs from the idiomatic standard configuration occurs at one and the same time with the more political recognition of the extreme vulnerability of the dispossessed Palestinian, whose very dreams have become incriminating. Okay? So the epiphany of idiomatic neologisms can thus lead the way to political empathy and solidarity, or so I hope. So the haunting resonance of the new idiom, ارتكب الحلم, commit the dream, its exposure of the incrimination of Palestinian dreams, may be seen to exacerbate a sense of helpless melancholy, or a thrust state of melancholization. But what I'm arguing in the book is that such a conclusion is incomplete because it fails to account for the new idiomatic expression as a melancholy act that stakes a claim to the Palestinian dream of a homeland on their stolen land. I will use two more examples of this sort, but which are actually much more, I would say, complex and courageous. And I will also, try to engage with them. So, in the penultimate poem of his diwan, Ward Aqal, Fewer Roses, Darwish writes perhaps one of the most deceptively simple first lines in a poem. وَنَحْنُ نُحِبُّ الْحَيَاةَ إِذَا مَا اسْتَطَعْنَا إِلَيْهَا سَبِيلًا. That is, and we love life if we find a way to it, or we love life if we can afford it. Okay? So this is clearly, for those who are familiar with the Quran, it's a hijacking of the Quranic verse, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حَجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنْ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا. Pilgrimage thereto is a duty, man out to Allah, those who can afford the journey. This is according to Abdullah Yusuf Ali translation of the Quran. So according to the Quran and Hadith, the Hajj is one of the most sacred requirements every Muslim who can afford it has to perform once in a lifetime. Not only does it cleanse the Hajj or Hajjah of all previous sins, but it also allows them to take stock of the history of Islam by visiting the place where the Quran was first revealed and by recalling events and reenacting experiences that shaped the trajectory of Islam and Muslims. So the question is, why does Darwish juxtapose here the Hajj, the fifth pillar of Islam, yet not one of its absolute or unconditional requirements, with the unconditional and self-evident right to life? I do not think that Darwish is suggesting here that life has become as unaffordable as Hajj, and that therefore death might be the answer, or as he puts it here, نحب الحياة إذا ما استطعنا إليها سبيلا ونزرع حيث أقمنا نباتا سريعا النمو ونحصد حيث أقمنا قتيلا. We love life if we find a way to it, and we plant where we settle some fast-growing plants and harvest the dead. Darwish's new configuration of the Quranic idiom may serve to accentuate the fundamental proximity, yet profound discrepancy between Muslims who go to Mecca by the millions every year and the Palestinians who lack the basic needs of life, such as food, shelter, and security. Insofar as it cleanses the Hajj or Hajjah of all sins, the Hajj is a passageway to a new life, unencumbered by the past. But the Palestinians Darwish seems to contend may not have had the experience of life in the first place. In fact, a life that is only sustainable through the diurnal exposure to death is not a life in the proper sense of the word, but an extended state of uncertainty and survival, and lies therefore at several removes from the quotidian experience of life as such. Darwish's idiomatic neologism underscores thus the contrast between the theological access of Muslims across the world to a new life through Hajj and the existential predicament of Palestinian refugees and exiles whose access, not to mention their human and political right to life, has been denied, if not foreclosed at the outset by the ongoing occupation of historical Palestine. So Darwish's passion here for what might be called the poetic swerve not only wrests the Quranic and Arabic idiom from its original context, but also grafts it into a distant yet far context in order to dramatize the surprising ties yet ironic differentials between the two contexts, okay? The old and the new. The axiomatics of salvation operative in the redemptive process of Hajj is mobilized and finally brought to bear on the dehumanizing process to which Palestinians are submitted. What Darwish does with the Quranic idiom is radically, I think, innovative in terms of its scope and technical heterogeneity. The new idiom, وَنَحْنُ نُحِبُّ الْحَيَاةَ إِذَا مَا اسْتَطَعْنَا إِلَيْهَا سَبِيلًا, is not only a neologism, like something totally new, but it is also a transformation of the semantic primitiveness of the Quranic idiom into the fecundity of and richness of the new idiom, which oftentimes falls between, I don't know how much you know about like poetics, but there are two figures here, like catachresis and metaphor, you know, so you can say either it's a catachresis or perhaps, you know, metaphor. So the new idiom is open-textured enough as to suggest that this is not merely a cri du coeur of a disenchanted and disheartened poet, but in no small measure a declaration of resistance and empowerment. So if we read closely, the letter ma istatan, which precedes mastatan, is also called in Arabic ma al-nafiya, which means the negative. Okay? In which case the idiom could also mean, and we love life precisely because we do not have access to it. Okay? So then it becomes, if you look closely, it becomes more of a rallying cry for, you know, for protest. Okay? So Darwish's transformational generative work on the classical Arabic idiom is part and parcel of his more wide-ranging politics of decolonial empowerment. I will add, you know, I will discuss here now one very famous idiom and then move on to Kanafani, okay? So this is a very famous idiom in the Arab world, تصبحون على وطن, okay? Which is the plan on تصبحون على خير, which means good night in English, okay? So Darwish here diverts the direction of the everyday expression without leaving it. That is, he infuses it with both human concerns and political grievances. Not only does تصبحون على وطن revitalize the hackneyed expression تصبحون على خير, but it also brings into bold relief the disconnect between wishing people good night and wishing them a homeland. Okay? So the intimate overlap between the residual form of the idiom تصبحون على خير and its novel configuration تصبحون على وطن becomes an allegorical dramatization of the embattled project of Palestinian nationhood, and above all a call for a decolonial future. Okay? So by grafting the loss of Palestine to the everyday expression, Darwish melancholicizes the structure of the everyday idiom, makes it simultaneously host the promise of a justice to come and reopen the wound of lived injustice every time it is uttered. Okay? This idiomatic neologism, تصبحون على وطن, not only holds and keeps open the promise of Palestinian nationhood, but it also makes it into the very condition of the continued pertinence of the standard expression for wishing people good night. تصبحون على خير. So the idiomatic neologism at work here is a testament to the extent to which some inassimilable loss has brought about a manifestation in language. So instead of تصبحون على خير, تصبحون على وطن. So because, you know, it's actually the homeland that we need. Darwish's idiomatic neologism suggests that the recovery from melancholia as a symptom of the Israeli occupation can only be achieved through melancholia as a psychoaffective commitment to the recovery of Palestine. Okay? So here, this is something we can discuss later. Darwish makes the Arabic idiom incorporate and carry the enormity of the Palestinian tragedy, subtly reducing the gap between form and affect, carefully melancholicizing the Arabic language in the process, mapping into its syntactic structure the idiomatic plight of Palestinians. Now I move on to Ganafani, and I'm going to discuss a very short story, which is an epistle. This epistle is about, it's actually titled Waraqa min Gaza, a letter from Gaza. And, given the time, actually, it's very pertinent. So, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the epistle, letter from Gaza. You probably are familiar. Okay, but it's. I think the plot is about two childhood friends that grew up together, and they had a dream of leaving Gaza and going to America and and become rich. Okay, and live the American dream. And one of them actually did leave Gaza, and his name is Mustafa. And he went to California, and he made arrangements for his friend, who is the speaker here in the letter, to catch up with him there in California. But the writer of the letter, or the speaker, or it might actually be Ganafani himself, he stayed behind, and then when he went back to Gaza from Kuwait to say goodbye to his family and to pack his bags and everything, he paid a visit to his niece in the hospital and saw that her leg was totally amputated from an Israeli strike. Okay, and then he decided to change his mind. Why am I going to save myself and leave my people behind? And so that's the lesson of this short episode. It's very short, and if you're not familiar with it, I think you can listen to it recited by John Berger. Very nice recitation on YouTube, in English also. It was written, of course, in Arabic. So let me read it since I put it together here. So throughout his short-lived creative career, Ganafani never tired of foregrounding the lived experiences of defeated individuals, not to profess the structural fragility of human beings, but to draw attention to their man-made plights and struggles. So Ganafani's literary moralia is dispersed throughout his album, but I will focus on Waraqa min Gaza, an early epistle that Ganafani wrote when he was actually only 20 years old. Okay, so imagine. So the nameless speaker, as I was mentioning, who is perhaps stand-in for Ganafani himself, addresses his letter to his childhood friend Mustafa, whom he is supposed to join in Sacramento, California. Mustafa seems to have made all the necessary arrangements for his friend's move to Sacramento to study civil engineering in the University of California. As I mentioned, both childhood friends had long ago vowed to carry on living together, to get out of Gaza. The short story could be found here in Men in the Sun and other Palestinian stories, by the way. So in Gaza, the speaker taught at UNRWA schools, but his meager salary was not enough for him to support his mother and his brother's widow and her 4 children. So he relied on good sums of money remitted to him by Mustafa, which he accepted in the dignified form of loans and not in the implied form of charity. So the speaker wrote the letter to Mustafa between 1955 and 1956, very early on, at a time when Israel increased its crackdown on returnees to their homes and families, and this was known as David Ben-Gurion's war on infiltration and on Palestinian paramilitary groups. So Israel launched several large-scale attacks on Gaza in the lead-up to the late October 56 tripartite aggression on Egypt by Israel, France, and Great Britain. It was in between these brutal Israeli onslaughts on Gaza that the speaker returns home from Kuwait to prepare himself for his imminent trip to California. Gaza's familiar scenes of wreckage, misery, and desolation, not to mention the foul odor of defeat which had filled his nostrils since the Nakba, only intensified the speaker's self-dejection and urge to flee to Green California and to sever all ties with Gaza. Turning the page swiftly on the wretched homeland and running away from all the obstacles to his self-flourishing in a remote land of limitless opportunity is the only form of salvation that had eaten up the speaker's mind until he makes a visit to his beautiful 13-year-old niece, Nadia, in the Gaza hospital and sees her completely amputated leg. Much to his own embarrassment, he discovers that, and I quote here from the epistle, Nadia had lost her leg when she threw herself on top of her little brothers and sisters to protect them from the bombs and flames that had fastened their claws into the house. Nadia could have saved herself, she could have run away, rescued her leg, but she didn't. End of quote. Nadia's tale of selfless sacrifice unsettled the speaker. His egocentric escapist schemes have, compared to Nadia's altruistic heroism, turned into sore points, fomenting in him feelings of ire and self-contempt. Kanafani makes use of the epistolary convention not only to solicit the confidentiality and trust of the reader, but also to create an overlapping communicative space from which to mentor and mobilize his audience. Not only does the pedagogical encounter with Nadia compel the speaker to reckon with the incumbent task of solidarity with his own defeated people, it also propels him to seek to transform the alienating social norms that feed rather than fight the desire for flight. It is in this sense that we must understand his final exhortation to Mustafa, and I quote here from the epistle, "I won't come to you, but you return to us. Come back to learn from Nadia's leg, amputated from the top of the thigh, what life is and what existence is worth. Come back, my friend, we are all waiting for you." End of quote. The speaker's belated melancholic turn is not a turn away from Gaza, but a return to that uncanny and repressed feeling that bound him and Mustafa to Gaza, which he now sees in a totally new light after his encounter with Nadia. And I will read how he sees the new Gaza after he goes out of the hospital. And I quote, "Everything in this new Gaza rose up in sadness." Of course, nothing changed on the ground. It's just his perception that has been transformed. "Everything in this new Gaza rose up in sadness. ينتفض حزنا over Nadia's amputated leg from the top of the thigh. It was not the kind of sadness that stopped at weeping. It was defiance. Even more than that, it was something akin to the restoration of the amputated leg." In his emotionally charged address to Mustafa, the speaker capitalizes on the spectral void created by the amputated leg as the locus of melancholia. That is, as the process of psychoaffective investiture that generates and sustains attachment to the sense of national consciousness and sovereignty. In this sense, melancholic attachment is not confined to the search for the concrete meaning of Nadia's loss, but extends contiguously to the void created by the disappearance and ethnic cleansing of historical Palestine, and to the incumbent task of rescuing loss from loss into perpetuity. In fact, before closing his letter by calling on Mustafa to come back home, the speaker signals to him the urgent necessity to recoup and retool the enigmatic feeling he experienced when he was first leaving Gaza. And I quote, This obscure feeling that you had as you left Gaza, this small feeling must grow into a giant deep within you. It must expand. You must seek it in order to find yourself here among the ugly debris of defeat. End of quote. So Kanafani institutes the process of melancholic mobilization as the horizon of decolonial subjectivity. He wagers on the recuperation and cultivation of an enigmatic feeling as the conduit for the tangled processes of self-individuation and solidarity. Kanafani's letter from Gaza exemplifies, I'm gearing toward the conclusion, how the melancholia of the oppressed operates even from within extreme conditions of precarity and defeat, and the way it sets alight in the speaker an infectious longing for collectivity and solidarity. Insofar as it compelled the speaker to recognize the fierce urgency of political solidarity with the amputee, Nadia, and with her besieged and bombarded Gaza, Kanafani's story is the product and exemplum of the melancholia of the oppressed, in which melancholization emerges as the symptom of colonization, while melancholicization as the midwife of decolonization. And we can expand on this in the Q&A. So the lesson of Kanafani's epistle is not just to pay tribute to Nadia's memory, but also to ensure that her originary commitment to collective salvation continues to inspire the struggle for national liberation and for an end to the ethno-settler apartheid occupation of historical Palestine. In a geopolitical battlefield that had for decades been the geostrategic target of Orientalist locutions and epistemological violence, melancholicizing is a delicate pedagogical process of enhancing critical consciousness and cognitive demystification that includes as much sensitization as unlearning of ideologically imbued modes of intelligibility. So Kanafani's letter from Gaza, in which the form of the story makes possible this chiastic reversal from melancholization to melancholicization, dramatizes the process of ethical and empathic indignation in tandem with the speaker's cognitive reversal and revised remapping of Gaza in light of Nadia's story of selfless sacrifice. So the speaker's counterintuitive decision to let go of the opportunity to pursue a potentially happy life in California, the American dream, matches only his eagerness to hold on to a life of utter suffering and misery in wounded and bleeding Gaza. The speaker agrees to assume a position of compassion, exposure, and vulnerability, and to take the same risks that Nadia took when she intervened on behalf of her brothers, in an attempt finally to live a life worthy of its name. A life of selfless sacrifice, irreducible to the pursuit of happiness he would have experienced it had he joined Mustafa in California. This belated fantasy of vulnerability as a condition of collectivity, of being with and for others, may very well serve as a corrective to the speaker's abnegation of responsibility and as also a signal of an ethics of solidarity that does not stop at bearing witness to the pain and suffering of the victims of Zionist oppression, but further commits to being there among them in the midst of peril and precarity. So throughout the book, that disappeared the picture. So throughout the book, I call for a comparative ethics of reading, the narrative of temporalities of the psyche at the crossroads of geopolitics and poetic form. I distinguish between static, paralyzing, impulsive or reactionary, melancholizing patterns of behavior, and self-reflexive and productive, as well as future-oriented melancholicizing practices, operative as I have shown in literary and cultural products, such as the idioms I was discussing. So for me, attending to the particularities of these melancholicizing practices, as they come to be rhetorically embedded in specific theoretical, visual, or literary texts, as those by Darwish and Gana, offers a key corrective to the melancolizing terms of reception of Arab culture in transnational contexts, increasingly cast under the shadow of Euro-American soft power dominance. Thank you, and تصبحون على وطن. I'll take questions or comments or yes.
Yes, I'm very interested with the way, like, I need more explanation in terms of its metaphorical and its in a literary tradition in understanding or like in interpreting the word of aqamna qatilan. So aqamna qatilan, the first idiom that yeah.
Oh my God, we're going to wait. Oh, which one?
The idiom, like harvest of the.
أقمنا نبات ونحسب حيث أقمنا قبيل. Yeah. So the question is what?
Like I want more explanation about this things because like.
No, I mean the English translation says, "And we love life if we find a way to it."
Okay.
And we plant where we settle some fast-growing plants and harvest the dead. I mean, I think as I try to deconstruct this idiom is whether because of the many people who are being targeted and killed, whether or not our access to life has become impossible. Okay?
Yes.
And there is that ban, of course, on the pilgrimage, which, of course, has to do with whether you can afford it or not. Okay? I mean, I think it's... Do you understand Arabic?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay.
That's
No, because sometimes it's very hard
yeah.
to translate, because of pan,
Yeah.
because of, especially a pan on an existing idiom. How are you going to translate the pan? That's the thing. You can translate it, but I don't know how you can translate the pan on the idiom, because the pilgrimage, if you can afford it, but then when he says, we love life, if we can afford it, and then it leaves you like, okay, what is he saying? It doesn't work, of course, it's a catachresis, it doesn't work. I mean, because life and hajj, that's two totally different things. But the fact that he juxtaposes them leaves it open for us to interpret what he wants to say. And that's what I see as a literary critic, that's what I see as my field, you know. And then I need to interpret at least in two ways. And the two ways that I have shared with you is that the first one is that the first one, which is the way in which it melancholizes, it makes you sad, it makes you feel depressed, which is we love life if we can afford it, which means, or if we can have access to it. It means, you know, we're being killed on a daily basis, but we love life, but we can't even live it because we're being massacred. Do you see what I mean? And that's what makes you sad. But the other one, which I spoke about, ma istatan, which means, you know, precisely because we cannot have access to it. And that one is melancholicizing, because it calls for you to actually act. I mean, it puts more, in other words, it makes life more precious, precisely because we're being massacred, we're being killed, we do not have access to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I'm like thinking like when the whole context, like when I say love and then fast-growing plants, like whenever like I imagine plants growing, I was like imagine about hope and expectation.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and instead of like using like whatever phrase for like, I like the way you translate it, like harvest the dead. It's like there are two things here. Harvest means like utilize,
yes.
what like people already left behind, those who are dying, like giving us hope, right? Like imagining the future land, the future hope, expectation.
So there are two ways of looking at that. Either our present is a graveyard, is a cemetery, you know, نحصد حيث أقمنا قتيلا, or precisely because we have paid such a great price, then it's we have to achieve something.
Yes.
Does that make sense? I mean, but the whole thing is very you can argue. I mean, even نحصد حيث أقمنا قتيلا is itself a catachresis in the sense that you can't say. I mean, we say we harvest, you know, wheat, we harvest olives. We don't say harvest the dead. So, that's another, another idiom, but I could have just also dealt with, you know. But you see, the ways in which, the poetry in Arabic is riddled with these idiomatic terms, which is like taken any, because, in Arabic we call idioms qawalib jaiza, which means they're finite. You cannot mess with them. Take it as it is or leave it. You cannot, for instance, interfere with the idiomatic expression in English to kick the bucket. You cannot say you kick the ball. So kick the bucket has one meaning, and it means, that's it. So you cannot mess with it. And in Arabic it's the same thing. But this guy is messing with them, and at a very fast pace. It's not like it's one after the other. Look here, ونحب الحياة ما استطعنا إليها سبيلا ونزرع حيث أقمنا نباتا زرعا ونحصد حيث أقمنا قتيلا. So he's messing with the idiom at every turn. And for me, it's not just play. I mean, there is play. Derrida wrote that famous essay on play, which became the inauguration of the post-structural movement, in which he shows that actually, intellectual and theoretical play is actually serious, because Darwish, you could see he's playing with the idioms. You could see that as like, he's making it into a game, but actually he's doing something very serious, intellectually and theoretically. And so that's what I'm trying to, I'm trying to argue, is that, even though this is play, it has to do with history and the overdetermination of history. Okay? And how to articulate that tragedy that is historical and not structural, It's historical. It's a product of a historical process of colonization or settler colonialism. And then the thing is that, it's, but this has been like the struggle in theory is like the issue of representation. What are the best ways of representing a historical catastrophe, or what is the best register, okay, or the best metaphor, or the best idiom, okay? I mean, remember, Adorno said poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, which means, this is like unthinkable. Just stop writing. Don't tell me anything. You cannot say, oh, this is like whatever, It's just stop there, you cannot. This is not something you can articulate in language. But did artists, did filmmakers, I mean, look at the Hollywood industry. I mean, it's all about, most of the big films I watched when I was young, they're all about the Holocaust. So, and then there is Norman Finkelstein, who eventually wrote a book called, the Holocaust industry. So it became an industry, right? While Adorno at first said, please, shut up. And then it became an industry. So that the question is, how do you really negotiate? How do you navigate between, the fact that it's an unspeakable atrocity, and the fact that you have to speak about it, you have to represent it, and those stakes are very high because they're both ethical and political. And for Darwish, he found in the idiom one way of dealing with that. He says, because if I distort the idiom, maybe you could see the ways in which the tragedy has distorted everything. I think that's one of the ways. I mean, it's not the only way, but I think for me, for me, in film Al Jannah, the Paradise Now, And of course, there is also an engagement with psychoanalysts who are, French, like Fathi ibn Slama, etc. So there are, the number of texts and the genres of texts are different. I chose this because I wanted to have like some kind of a homogeneous thread to the talk. Because if I discuss the film, it's impossible. It's impossible to give a talk on an entire book. So the choice